So in the introduction to this video series, I introduced you to the idea of the gluttony and sloth theory of obesity and the calories in, calories out theory. Okay? Basically, these theories, which this is the main paradigm of almost everyone in the fitness and nutrition industry, basically say that fat loss and fat gain are the result of your conscious behavioral habits around the way you eat and the way you exercise. If you're overweight, it's because you have no self-control around eating and you're lazy. If you're lean, it's because this implies that it's because you're watching your caloric intake every day and you're exercising to burn so-and-so amount of calories. And this is the reason why lean people are lean and fat people are fat. Well, let me ask you a question. You may have noticed that the body weight tends to stay pretty stable over time. That you may weigh 152 pounds or 176 pounds or 137 or 215 or whatever it is, but you tend to hover right around that spot for month after month, year after year. Now this is kind of amazing when you think about it, because just a tiny imbalance of calories, like say 50 calories a day, discrepancy between the amount you're burning and the amount you're eating, should over time result in huge changes in weight loss. But they don't. The body weight stays stable over time. Now, why does this happen? Is it because you are doing complex calculations in your head every day where you're figuring in your basal metabolic rate and you're counting up all the calories from the activity you did that day, and then you're counting up all the calories from all the meals you ate, and you're making sure that the amount you ingested matches very precisely the amount you burned that day? Is that why your body weight stays stable? Or is it something else? Well, actually what's going on is that in exactly the same way that we have our blood oxygen level regulated, our blood sugar level regulated, our blood pressure level regulated, our breathing rate, our pulse rate, all regulated biologically, our body also has built into it a biological regulatory mechanism for our body weight and body fat. Okay? And this is wired into us over the course of evolution. Why? Well, the reason that we needed a system to regulate our body weight over time is basically because throughout most of the course of human evolution, we didn't have grocery stores around every corner. Food availability was not always a guarantee. Sometimes food was scarce. We had to deal with droughts. We had to deal with harsh winters. We had to deal with food shortages and famine. And as a result of that, the genes that got passed on over time were the ones that were really good about surviving periods of food shortage or famine and then quickly rebounding to a normal, healthy weight. Okay? And what this is, what I'm referring to, is something that obesity researchers now understand as the central key to fat loss and fat gain. And it's called the body fat set point. This is the central key to everything if you want fat loss. And, interestingly enough, it's also something that pretty much no one in the fitness industry and the nutrition industry talk about or have any awareness of. So the reason that your body weight stays stable over long periods of time has nothing to do with you calculating your metabolic rate and the amount of calories you burn during exercise and counting up all your calories that you ate that day. It has to do with the simple fact that humans are wired with a complex system of brain regions and hormones that are designed to regulate our body weight. And the way that they do that is by precisely matching the amount of calories in to the amount of calories out. In other words, when there are discrepancies, when one day you may burn more calories or eat more calories or eat way less calories, or you may do it for a period of time, the body is designed in such a way that it regulates how much you eat and how much you burn to match whatever is going on in the environment. So for example, if you suffer through a famine, what happens is two things. Hunger level goes up, which motivates you to find food, since food is scarce. And if you can't find food, the metabolism slows down. Okay? And this is all a very intelligent mechanism that is designed to make sure that you survive during this period of famine. This is how the body fat regulation system works. So the body fat regulation system is really not all that difficult to understand. It's pretty simple. What happens if you, for example, burn a bunch of calories, if you do a bunch of exercise? In evolutionary terms, this might have meant that you were at war with another tribe, or you had to run from one place to another, or you went on a long hunt. Okay? What happens is hunger goes up. Hunger goes up, motivates you to find food and eat to replace all of the calories you burned that day. And if that doesn't happen, then metabolism drops. So for example, if you decide to do a bunch of extra exercise, what does your body do in response to that? Well, it increases hunger levels, makes you hungrier, you go and find food to eat more calories to make up for the extra calories that you burned. It's keeping the amount of calories in stable and consistent with the amount of calories out. On the other hand, if you are dieting, if you're restricting calories, or you're suffering through a famine and food is not available, what happens then? Well, hunger goes up, but since you can't find food, the metabolism has to slow down in order to match the decreased amount of calories that you're taking in. Again, it's doing this to cancel out any caloric deficit and ensure that the amount of calories in match the amount of calories out. This is how the body fat set point works, and this is how your body weight stays stable over time. And even though you may lose weight in the short term by either starving during a period of famine or by following the typical fat loss advice of burning more calories than you take in, you may lose weight for a period of time, but then the weight quickly rebounds. This is the yo-yo phenomenon that many people know about. Now, if you understand this idea of the body fat set point and the fact that the body is always wired in such a way that it cancels out any caloric deficit, it matches the amount of calories in to the amount of calories out, then you immediately understand that there is a huge hole in the calories in, calories out theory. And this is why obesity researcher Stéphane Gayunès says this is where the calories in, calories out theory fails. It does not account for that dynamic regulation of energy balance. It doesn't account for these fluctuations in hunger and metabolic rate that match the amount of calories in to the amount of calories out. Now, the bigger problem with the gluttony and sloth theory of obesity and the just burn more calories than you take in approach to fat loss is this. It implies that fat gain and fat loss are all consciously driven processes, are all the result of your choices around how you eat and how you exercise. And this just is not true. There is no real credible scientific evidence to show that fat gain and fat loss are the result of consciously driven processes. In fact, the science is extremely clear that when you try to lose fat by starving yourself or by burning more calories than you take in, over 95% of people fail to achieve long-term fat loss, and they end up regaining all the fat that they lost, and usually plus some extra. So the right way to understand fat gain and fat loss is that it is a biologically regulated process that you have limited, very limited, conscious control over. Okay? And to understand this idea, let me illustrate with an analogy. Breathing, for example, or sleeping. Okay? These are both processes that we have some degree of conscious control over, but they're also, more importantly, biologically regulated processes. So for example, you can hold your breath and deprive your body of oxygen. I can tell you, oh, just hold your breath, starve your body of oxygen. And you can do that. You can hold your breath. The same thing is true with sleep. I can tell you, deprive your body of sleep. You can force yourself to stay up till 2 in the morning, set your alarm clock for 4 in the morning so you only get 2 hours of sleep, and great, you forced yourself to get only 2 hours of sleep. But what happens after that? What happens if you hold your breath? Okay? You deprive your body of oxygen, but then your body's going to force you to start breathing again, and it's going to start hyperventilating in compensation for the fact that you were just depriving it of oxygen. Now, the same exact thing happens with sleep. If you deprive your body of sleep, You only sleep 2 hours a night. Guess what the body does to compensate for that? Well, the next night, or maybe two nights later, now all of a sudden, you need extra sleep. You're even more tired the next day, and you sleep 11 hours instead of 8 hours like you normally would, right? This is pretty common sense stuff. But we don't apply this same logic and this same understanding of biological regulation to fat loss. But this is exactly the same thing that is going on with fat loss. If you deprive your body of calories by burning more calories than you take in, the body compensates for that. The body fat set point kicks in, either hunger goes up, metabolism goes down, and one of those two things counteracts this. So hunger goes up, forces you to eat more. This is why the vast majority of studies done on exercise show no fat loss whatsoever. It's because people simply eat more and cancel out any caloric deficit from the extra 500 calories they burned with that workout. And this is also why dieting, or starving the body of calories, shows short-term weight loss. When you forcibly starve your body of calories, deprive it of calories, you absolutely will get short-term weight loss. Then the body compensates in exactly the same way it did when you were holding your breath or depriving it of sleep. The body compensates, slows the metabolism, you regain all the fat you lost. And that's how the body fat set point system works. So if you understand this idea of the body fat regulation system and why the body weight stays stable over long periods of time, there's one question that should immediately be jumping out in your mind right now, and that is, then how do people get fat? Why does the body weight go up over time if we are wired to keep our body weight stable over time? And that's a great question. The answer to it is a couple things. One, our bodies are actually wired much better to protect against weight loss than they are against weight gain. So if you think about this in an evolutionary context, what was a bigger threat to your survival 100,000 years ago? Was it that you were going to overeat and get obese and die from that? Or was it that you were going to have a food shortage and not be able to find food and starve to death? Well, obviously 100,000 years ago, food shortage was a much bigger threat to our survival. And this was true for the vast majority of the time that our genome was evolving. So the genes that got passed on were the ones that were particularly good at preventing death from starvation, and not necessarily the ones that were so good at preventing death from fat gain and obesity. So the body fat regulation system is wired to defend against fat loss much better than it is to defend against fat gain. The other thing we need to consider, perhaps the most important thing, is the simple fact that if we look at wild animals, such as a deer or a lion or a cheetah or a wolf or whatever, have you ever seen an animal like that in the wild that is overweight or obese? The answer is clearly no. You do not see wild animals that are obese. Okay? So why is it that humans get obese and animals don't? Even if you look at wild humans, and what I mean by that is hunter-gatherer humans still living a very simple life out in nature. And we don't have to invoke theories of, people who lived 30,000 years ago. We can talk about tribal populations, hunter-gatherer populations that exist today. And what we see in those populations is basically they don't get obese. These people, just like wild animals, wild humans, don't really become overweight and obese. Now, if we understand the obesity epidemic, we can look at this and say this is a modern phenomenon. This is something that really has only been happening in the last 100 years. So this is not, a problem with our biology or a problem with our genetics. This is a problem with modern civilization. And certain factors in our current modern environment are obesogenic, meaning they predispose and cause obesity. So what this means is that obesity and overweight is, by definition, a dysfunctional body fat set point. The body fat set point mechanism, your biological regulation system for regulating your body fat percentage, is not operating correctly. So there are certain factors in the modern environment that cause this system to dysfunction. And when that happens, you get a discrepancy between the amount of calories taken in and the amount of calories burned. Now, the important distinction here is this isn't a problem of your conscious decision to consume more calories than you burned. And so the solution is not simple starvation and willpower. Eat less and burn more calories. That implies that it's all happening within your conscious control. And the important thing that's going on here is this is a biologically regulated process, and it is a biological dysfunction when you're overweight or obese. And the right way to correct it is not through starvation, not through depriving the body of calories. That actually just drives the body fat set point up over time, which is the opposite of what you want. So what we need is to re-engage this natural biological regulation system that regulates our body fat. We need to re-engage it so that it is working properly again. So the next question becomes, what is it in this modern environment that is causing the body fat set point mechanism to dysfunction? If you want to understand fat loss, if you want to approach fat loss intelligently, you need to understand why this system is not operating properly and how to re-engage it. So there are two factors in the modern environment that are causing a dysfunctional body fat set point mechanism, and these are the two factors that are at the heart of the obesity epidemic. This is why the body fat set point rises over time and why we create a disharmony between the amount of calories we take in and the amount of calories we burn. Okay? These are the factors that are disrupting our biology. So the first factor is neurological. Okay? It's something going on in the brain that is causing this body fat regulation system to not function properly. The second factor is on the cellular and hormonal levels. It's something happening at the cellular level in your body that's causing the body fat set point mechanism to not function properly. So let's look at the neurological side of why the body fat set point rises over time, why people become overweight and obese. Okay? So what is it that's happening in the brain that's driving this obesity epidemic? Okay? Well, basically, it's addiction in simple terms. We have something called the hedonic center of our brain. That word hedonic is very similar to hedonistic, and what it means is pleasure seeking. This is the pleasure seeking part of the brain. Now, in exactly the same way that when someone does cocaine, for example, this hedonic center of the brain lights up. You feel pleasure, euphoria. The same exact thing happens when we consume what are called highly rewarding foods. And in simple terms, all that really means is foods that taste really good. Okay? This is called the food reward hypothesis of obesity. And the research is pretty clear that this is a huge factor in the obesity epidemic. Now, what's going on is basically this. You consume highly rewarding foods, foods that taste really, really good and light up that pleasure center of the brain. Now, what kind of foods are they? Well, they're processed foods. We've all heard about the dangers of processed foods. We shouldn't consume, junk processed foods. But here's really why. This is the neurological and biological reasons of what's going on, why this drives obesity. Okay, why 250 calories or 500 calories from processed food is different from 500 calories of fruits and vegetables. Okay, and what's going on is that processed food that's packed with sugar and packed with fat, basically the combination of those two things, the sugar and fat, causes a lot of pleasure in our brain. So if you think of foods that contain lots of sugar and lots of fat, processed foods at the same time, basically lights up that pleasure center of the brain, and over time, if you do that, if you light it up and light it up and light it up in exactly the same way that it does with cocaine, it creates an addiction. And you then start eating, you start seeking out food and eating food, not because of biological need, not because your body actually needs and craves energy, but because this hedonic center of your brain is stimulating you and motivating you to go find food because it wants to be lit up again. Okay? So this creates a disharmony between the amount of calories you're taking in and the amount of calories your body actually needs. In other words, your brain center, your hedonic center of your brain, is actually overriding the normal body fat regulation system that keeps you matched with the calories in to calories out, that keeps your body weight stable over time. Now all of a sudden, you're not eating because of biological need, you're eating because you want psychological pleasure. Now the other aspect of what's going on neurologically is something called food variety, and it basically is exactly what it sounds like. If you have a high variety of foods in a given meal, what that does is it also drives you to overconsume calories. So let me put this in context to make it really easy to understand. Have you ever been having a dinner and you're eating this dinner and you're eating and eating and eating, and then all of a sudden you feel full? Okay? So you feel full, and then, I can't eat anymore, I'm full to the brim. And then all of a sudden somebody goes, oh, do you want dessert? And then all of a sudden you find room, right? You have room now for that ice cream or for that cake or whatever it is. You were full on the dinner, but you're not full for this new dessert food that's coming out, right? We've all experienced this. And what happens at a buffet? Well, you get what's called unbuckle your pants syndrome. And what that means is that when you're presented with this huge array of different foods and all these different desserts, now all of a sudden you may feel full on one food, but you're not full on another food. So what this is telling us, and this is proven by the research, is that fullness, the feeling of satiety or fullness, is actually food specific. So if you're going to buffets all the time, which is something that is a modern invention, which means that if you're having a huge variety of different foods in every meal, you are much more likely to overconsume calories beyond your biological need. This is a neurologically mediated process in exactly the same way that food reward is. This is food-specific fullness. And what it means is that when you're presented with this huge variety of foods, you tend to overconsume calories beyond your biological need. So, in terms of the neurological side of obesity, what we have is high food variety and highly rewarding foods, which are really processed foods packed with sugar and fat together. Okay. These are the things that neurologically drive obesity. They drive food addiction, and they cause you to be out of harmony with your body's natural biological body fat regulatory system. Let's talk about the hormonal and cellular aspects of what's driving the increase in body fat set point. So there's something really interesting going on in people who are overweight and obese that's almost never talked about. Now, remember I explained this idea of how the body fat set point works. So basically, the way that it's keeping your body fat stable is by matching the amount of calories in to the amount of calories out. And it does that by regulating two things: hunger and your metabolism. Okay, so burn more calories, hunger goes up, you eat more calories. Eat way less calories during a famine or a diet, the metabolism slows down to try to match the amount of calories that you're taking in. Okay? So when you undereat, the metabolism slows down. So when you overeat, believe it or not, the metabolism actually goes up, and your body starts burning more calories in response to overeating, to an abundance of food. Again, to try to match the amount of calories in to the amount of calories out. You take in more, the body burns more. So the interesting thing about obesity is that they are consuming more calories than they're burning. They have this excess of calories that's being deposited in the form of fat. So they have this abundance of calories, yet their bodies on a cellular level and on a hormonal level are actually behaving in the same way that they would be if they were being starved. So there is this huge discrepancy there. This is why the body fat set point system is not functioning properly in people who are overweight and obese. On a physiological level, obese people are behaving in a way that is very similar to an anorexic person that is being chronically starved of nutrition. Yet, at the same time, they have this huge abundance of energy. So what we see in obese people is high hunger levels, which is indicative of being starved, and low body temperature, which is indicative of a slow metabolism, which happens in response to being starved. Okay, so again, you have this paradoxical situation. You have a slow metabolism, you're tired, you're lethargic, you have a low body temperature, you have high hunger levels, yet you also have this abundance of energy. So it doesn't make sense. Something's going wrong in this situation. Now, what's going on is basically this: metabolic damage. Okay? You are damaging your metabolism. And when the metabolism gets damaged on a cellular level, the body's not functioning properly, the cells are not getting the energy they need to function properly, and even though there is this abundance of calories being supplied to the body, the cells are still being starved. This is the situation that results from metabolic damage. Now, what causes metabolic damage? This is the critical factor that we need to understand. There are basically two things that cause metabolic damage. One is toxic foods, and I'm going to get into which specific foods those are. But toxic foods such as vegetable oils, omega-6 polyunsaturated fats, gluten, and several other foods can actually promote metabolic damage, and they can cause the cells to basically starve for energy, even though energy is actually being supplied to the body. So you get this discrepancy between the amount of energy going in and the amount that the cells are actually able to access and use. Now, the other thing that's causing metabolic damage, interestingly enough, is actually trying to burn more calories than you take in. It is following the typical fat loss advice to burn more calories than you take in, to do a bunch of exercise, to restrict calorie intake. This, just as I explained before, creates a state of physiology that is identical to what our ancestors experienced during a famine. And when that happens, the metabolism slows down. And if you do it often enough, the metabolism stays slow. So this is why you can get someone who is overweight and obese, that their cells are still behaving like they're starving for energy. They have all the symptoms of a slow metabolism despite overeating. So we've all heard of this phenomenon called yo-yo dieting. And yo-yo dieting is the basic idea that, somebody who's overweight goes on a diet, they lose weight for a period of time, and then they rebound back to their previous weight. Well, actually, a more accurate term for what's going on here is called check mark dieting. And if you think of the shape of a check mark, it looks like this, right? So if you think of a graph of your body weight over time, and you track your body weight over time, this is actually what's happening with dieting. You diet, you get short-term weight loss, the metabolism slows down, and then that slow metabolism predisposes to weight regain, and you get metabolic damage in the process. Okay, so your body gets a slower metabolism, it becomes harder to lose weight, and easier to regain weight. And if you think about this in a survival context, it makes sense. We're talking about famine. That's what it means to burn more calories than you take in. When you send the body the signal that it needs to be good at surviving periods of famine or burning more calories than you take in, it gets really good at slowing down the metabolism and hanging on to fat at all costs. Now, dieting is actually the single biggest predictor of future weight gain. Okay? And this makes sense. Again, we think of dieting on a very superficial level. Restrict calories and you get fat loss. It's that simple. People will tell you fat loss is not rocket science. All you got to do is eat less and burn more. But while that makes sense on a very superficial level, it does not take into account how the body responds. And the way that the body responds is by slowing down the metabolism, and you get this check mark phenomenon. You lose weight for a period of time, and then you regain all the weight you lost, and you usually add some. This is why people who are chronic dieters, chronically trying to lose fat, actually end up losing fat. They lose 30 pounds, and then they gain 40 back. They lose 40 pounds, then they gain 50 back. This is why the body weight goes up over time, from metabolic damage. Two things cause metabolic damage: toxic foods and chronic dieting and exercise. So once we understand the neurological aspects of what's driving the obesity epidemic, we can understand how to fix it. And this is pretty simple. This is a simple fix. This isn't about doing special high-tech diets. We need to understand and remember that the natural state of humans, just like wild animals, is lean. From a neurological perspective, remember we have two things that are driving this disharmony between the amount of calories in to the amount of calories out. And those two things really are highly rewarding food and high food variety. So the way to fix this is pretty simple. It doesn't involve anything fancy. It's really, really straightforward. And all you have to do to fix this is make the commitment to get off of processed food. Eliminate all processed food from your diet completely and eat simple meals. Simple meals that are based on whole foods with relatively low food variety. Okay? Now this doesn't mean that you have to eat bland stuff, that your meals are going to be boring, that they're not going to taste good. Nature has designed things in a way that is congruent with our biology. And we don't get food addictions to natural foods. We really only get them to modern processed foods. So making the simple commitment, although it's going to be hard at first for many people, just making the simple commitment to getting processed foods out of the diet, eating only whole food meals, and not eating, 4-course meals, but eating just a simple dinner with maybe 1 or 2 things, just that alone, that commitment to eating only whole natural foods is going to allow you to break free of this food addiction that's driving you neurologically to overconsume calories relative to your biological need. So the way out of this neurological imprisonment is really, really simple. All you have to do is make the commitment to eating only whole, natural, unrefined, unprocessed foods. When we look at things on a cellular and hormonal level, as I told you before, there are 2 really critical factors that are causing this discrepancy between calories in, calories out, and biologically driving the body fat set point up. And those 2 things, again, are metabolically toxic foods and 2, chronic dieting and exercise. So the main thing that we need to understand here is 1, do not ever diet. Do not ever forcibly restrict calories against your body's will. This is a recipe for metabolic slowdown, and even if it causes weight loss in the short term, which it very well might do, it's going to cause weight regain as soon as the metabolism slows down. This is not only moving you in the right direction, it's actually moving you in the wrong direction. Remember that checkmark dieting phenomenon we talked about before, okay? It's driving the body fat set point up. So it's kind of counterintuitive. There's a trap going on here. This burn more calories than you take in approach to fat loss works to cause fat loss, and then slowly it causes your body fat set point to creep up. There's a trap there that needs to be avoided at all costs. This is why you should never, ever diet and deprive your body of calories below what it actually craves. Now, the other thing that we need to understand is the strict avoidance of metabolically toxic foods. Now, what are those foods? The main culprits are refined carbohydrates, grains in particular, and vegetable oils, which is probably the single most significant. Okay? Vegetable oils are things like canola oil, safflower oil, soy oil, etc. These are things that have only come onto the scene that humans never ate prior to the last 100 years, which happened to neatly coincide with the obesity epidemic. Okay? And if we look at a graph of the increase in omega-6 vegetable oil consumption relative to the obesity epidemic, what we see is almost exactly parallel lines, meaning the omega-6 line looks like this. It goes up, from the 1970s till now. It goes like this, and the obesity epidemic does the exact same thing. Okay, so the obesity epidemic is happening in conjunction with this increase in omega-6 vegetable oils. Now, what is it about these omega-6 vegetable oils that is so toxic and so damaging to your body? Well, basically, there's a whole bunch of effects that happen. Okay? But to simplify it down, one, they're readily oxidizable compounds. One, these are compounds that are highly unstable and react with oxygen and become rancid and oxidize very, very quickly. Now, that is happening inside of your bloodstream. Now, what I mean by that is they literally, these compounds, these omega-6 oils, literally react with the oxygen floating around in your bloodstream. They steal oxygen from your cells, and they turn into what are called prostaglandins, which are a mediator of inflammation and wreak all kinds of inflammatory havoc in your body. Okay? These are absolutely 100% toxic compounds that destroy your metabolism. The other thing that they do is they cause inflammation in the gut, and they can actually promote leaky gut and cause all kinds of toxins from the gut that shouldn't be getting into the bloodstream to leak into the bloodstream, further causing inflammation, an increase in stress hormones, and basically what they do is they cause a big cascade of stress hormones and inflammation. Stress hormones and inflammation are toxic to your metabolism. They slow down your metabolism and they cause metabolic damage. Now, what that means on a cellular level is when you have these omega-6 polyunsaturated fats, these vegetables floating around your system, then you get this cascade of stress hormones and inflammation. The cells have a harder time taking in energy. Specifically, you get insulin resistance, where the cells have a harder time using carbohydrates for fuel. Now, what does that do? Well, basically, the cells start starving for energy. They have a hard time accessing and using the energy that you're actually putting into your body. Now, you remember I told you before how when the body fat set point mechanism works, if you overeat, if you have an abundance of calories, metabolism goes up. And I explained to you that in overweight and obese people, you see this paradox of the body is seemingly starving on a cellular level. The body's acting like it's starving, yet it has this abundance of calories. You're supplying it with tons of food. It even has this excess of calories in the form of fat on the body. Yet the cells are still somehow starving. Okay? Polyunsaturated fats, omega-6 fatty acids, are one of the main contributors, if not the single most important contributor, to this discrepancy, this difference between the amount of calories that you're actually putting in versus the amount of calories that your cells are accessing, because they block the cells from utilizing carbohydrates. Now, unfortunately, these vegetable oils, things like canola, soy, safflower, sunflower oil, corn oil, all these types of oils, they have seeped their way into the food supply and are now in just about every processed food. Okay, for everything from your favorite breakfast cereal to bagels to breads to cakes to you name it, if it's in a package, it's almost a guarantee that it has some kind of canola oil or soy oil built into it. Now, this is another reason that you need to make the commitment to eating whole, unrefined foods, because they don't have these toxic, metabolically toxic compounds built into them. Okay? So really the only way to avoid these toxic omega-6 fats is to eat whole, unprocessed food. Okay? The other significant thing, the other significant source of these omega-6 fats is farm-raised animal meats. So if we compare grass-fed to conventionally raised beef, for example, or chicken, the conventionally raised chicken, the conventionally raised beef, and farm-raised seafood all has huge amounts of omega-6, whereas the grass-fed beef, the free-range chicken, and the wild-caught seafood contains very, very small amounts of omega-6 fatty acids. So the other thing that needs to be done in terms of correcting this situation, avoiding these metabolically toxic compounds, is you need to switch to getting all of your animal proteins from grass-fed, free-range beef and chicken and eggs, and wild-caught seafood instead of farm-raised seafood. So the most important thing to do if you want to avoid metabolic damage is, one, remember, eat only whole, natural, unrefined foods, nothing packaged or processed. And 2, your animal foods need to come from grass-fed beef, free-range chicken and eggs, and wild seafood, as opposed to conventionally raised and farm-raised animals. That is going to basically guarantee that you do not have significant quantities of this toxic omega-6 fat. The other main thing that's causing metabolic damage, remember, is this chronic dieting and exercise. And I told you before, never to restrict calories, never to try to burn more calories than you take in. The reality is, over time, you can't. You need to accept that your body is biologically wired to match the amount of calories taken in to the amount of calories burned. What this is all about is getting back into harmony with eating for your body's biological need, okay? So what you're going to do from a nutrition perspective in terms of how many calories you should eat, you should always eat in accordance with your body's biological need. Overcoming that food addiction that I talked about earlier and avoiding these metabolically toxic compounds that cause this discrepancy between the amount of calories you're actually taking in versus the amount that your cells are actually are able to take in and utilize. Okay? If you take care of those two principles, and then you also understand the simple fact that your body's always matching calories in to calories out, then the way that we approach nutrition is to eat in accordance with our body's actual biological need. You're providing your body with the amount of calories that it actually requires, which is going to allow you to avoid metabolic damage and metabolic slowdown that results from forcible calorie deprivation. And you're going to rely on your exercise. You're going to rely on re-engaging the body fat set point system and then creating this environment through exercise, through doing high intensity body propulsion exercise to lower the body fat set point. That's what this system is really about. It's about acting in harmony with your body's biology, working with the intelligence of the body to re-engage the body fat set point so that it's no longer dysfunctional, so that it's working the way it should be, and then using exercise to create this added stimulus that drives the body fat set point down. So what I've shown you in this series of videos is that fat loss is not about starvation and willpower. Being overweight is not just about gluttony and sloth. It's not just about calories in, calories out. This is not within your conscious control. And if you're overweight, it's not your fault. This is all biologically regulated processes. You have the neurological side of what's going on that's creating this dysfunctional body fat set point mechanism. And then you have the cellular and hormonal side of what's going on and creating this dysfunctional body fat set point mechanism. Now remember all these wild animals, the wolf, the lion, the cheetah, the deer, you name it, okay? They're all lean. And humans are exactly the same thing. When we are acting in accordance with the evolutionary context that we evolved in, okay? When we are acting in ways that are congruent with the environment that our genome was shaped in, we naturally express leanness. Obesity and overweight is a modern epidemic. You remove those modern factors that are driving it, and all of a sudden you re-engage the body fat set point mechanism, and you get lean effortlessly without forcible calorie deprivation. Okay? So there are 4 key principles that we need to rehash in order to understand how to actually get lean and lose fat the intelligent way, the way that works with your biology rather than against it. So the neurological side of things, we have the highly rewarding foods and high food variety, okay? And we can overcome that simply by making the commitment to eating simple meals that are based on whole, natural, unrefined foods, okay? That overcomes this neurological addiction to food, and we can now eat in accordance with our biological need rather than eating from psychological pleasure. The other thing that we can do is change the hormonal and cellular side of things. And we do that by, 1, avoiding those refined carbohydrates like grains, for example. So you get your carbs from whole food sources like fruits and root vegetables rather than breads and pastas and cereals, okay? And you avoid omega-6 fats, these metabolically toxic compounds, and you avoid omega-6 fats, these metabolically toxic compounds that are found in farm-raised meats and all these vegetable oils that people commonly cook with and that are found all over in these packaged products that you find on the shelves of grocery stores everywhere. Okay? These simple things alone, irrespective of knowing anything else about nutrition, if you just do these simple things, you will naturally re-engage the body fat set point and it will drive you towards leanness without any forcible calorie deprivation. Just these simple things alone, okay? Overcoming the food addiction side, getting rid of metabolically toxic compounds, making the commitment to eat only whole, unrefined, natural foods. Just these things alone, understanding how the body fat set point mechanism works, overcoming the neurological imprisonment of food addiction, getting rid of metabolically toxic compounds, and making the commitment not to forcibly starve the body of calories. Okay? Just these simple things alone, if you knew nothing else about nutrition, just through these simple things alone, the body fat set point mechanism will get re-engaged and it will start driving your body fat set point down without any forcible calorie deprivation whatsoever. This is the way that you work intelligently with the biology of your body rather than trying to fight against it in a battle that you cannot win. This is the intelligent approach to fat loss.